Yes, I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, so my focus is on how culture and local institutions kind of shape people's behavior and actions. And I'm really interested in using that approach to address sustainable development. So how can people be motivated to use resources more sustainably? My specific research focuses on interaction between conservation and development. So attempts to balance biodiversity protection with poverty alleviation, and especially attempts to kind of use biodiversity conservation as a mechanism for poverty alleviation. So this paper is a work in progress, and it is an attempt to explore the extent to which this new idea of the planetary as a new kind of conceptual lens and mode of analysis can be used to understand how politics is working today, and especially how environmental politics or conservation politics is working. This argument is that we've moved beyond this phase when we talk about globalization and moved to this area of the planetary. And that's based on a couple different ideas. Right? The first is that globalization was about forging links across the globe, but now we've kind of transcended that, and we're starting to do our politics from kind of a bird's eye view, looking down on the globe as a whole and seeing it as one integrated whole that in a sense we've kind of already occupied and filled up, and now it's about managing the remaining space. And partially that's tied out with the idea that we've entered this new geological era called the Anthropocene, in which, in a sense, the human signature is pervasive around the entire Earth, and you can't argue that there's any space that we haven't touched with our signature, and that kind of changes our relationship with the planet. The third aspect of this planetary lens is the idea that even though we have this kind of pervasive human signature, we also have to recognize more fundamentally our independence with other species, and the fact that we don't necessarily dominate the globe, even though we influence all of it, and really have to start rethinking our relationship with other species and incorporating them into our modes of governance. So how it is that we can actually then integrate kind of non-humans and their own needs and interests into our politics. So bringing those three things together is the idea that we need to move away from globalization as our conceptual lens for thinking about politics and towards this idea of the planetary. And I'm interested in thinking about how that applies to conservation politics, which has traditionally been kind of approached more through this kind of human-centered lens of people deciding how it is that nature should be managed and what it would look like if we start adopting this kind of more multi-species perspective. So I've been looking at conservation politics for a long time and just seeing the way in which it shifted over time. Right? So it began with the attempt to find specific areas and try to take the animals and plants that were in it and preserve them from human development through protected areas. And then there was a recognition that creating these little forest islands wasn't really enough to protect biodiversity because they become isolated, right? And there's also the issue that they're often surrounded by human populations that aren't really benefiting from conservation. So how can we simultaneously then incorporate human populations into conservation, but also then connect different conservation areas? So over time then, conservation has broadened its focus from these specific areas to larger contexts, right? So we have integrated conservation and development programs that then shade into biodiversity corridors, that then shade into these transnational projects that try to link different conservation areas across borders, that then shade into this long landscape approach of trying to integrate conservation areas throughout an entire kind of region or continent, right? But now even more than that, there's this shift to thinking about global biodiversity as a whole, right? In a relationship between all these different areas. And if we want to preserve, say, a certain percentage of biodiversity, then what percentage of the Earth's surface needs to be kind of molded into this interconnected conservation space that would allow that to happen, right? So there's these approaches that label themselves half Earth, or nature needs half, that basically argues that half of the planet needs to be kind of created into this integrated conservation space. And so I see this as kind of like a new scale of thinking about how conservation relates to development throughout the world that potentially needs its own kind of framework of analysis. And that's where the idea of the planetary potentially becomes useful. Precisely this idea of moving towards this planetary level, right? So one of the critiques of globalization is it's all about kind of managing the interrelationships between nation states, right? But national sovereignty remains at the center of things. So part of the argument of the planetary is there's various processes, including things like the COVID virus, climate change, that of course transcend national boundaries, national interests, and that national sovereignty ends up becoming a limitation to actually dealing with these things, right? I mean, it's an old kind of argument, and global governance has been designed to try to also then address these same kind of processes, but the argument is it's been fundamentally limited by the fact that it still kind of holds national sovereignty at its center. So finding some way to divest authority away from nation states and create actual supranational institutions that are able to operate on a planetary basis, I think, is one of the major challenges going forward. Because if we think about challenges like climate change, right, we've been trying to address it through this kind of global governance architecture for the last 30 years, and I think it's fair to say that that attempt has failed miserably, right? And if we don't move to a different way of approaching things, then we are going to have very serious problems in the years ahead. So somehow transcending national sovereignty, which has been the basis of international order for the last several hundred years at least, I think is one of the major challenges that needs to be confronted, and hopefully the idea of the planetary helps to address that. Yeah, I think this is a really good way to really see what is really happening kind of on the leading edge of a field, right? What people are thinking about right now, and are able to kind of present in a relatively safe space where you can get constructive feedback, right? When you go on stage at a larger conference, then it can be a very intimidating forum. You feel this pressure to present ideas as if they're already well thought through, and they're more staged in this kind of attack and defense kind of format, right? So having a more working paper oriented discussion group is much more comfortable to really present ideas that you haven't necessarily thought through that well, but you think potentially have some potential, and have that kind of discussion. And I think it's very useful for students to see that work, right? Because when you see something that comes out in print, you don't really see all the back work that went into producing all of this stuff, the many drafts that it went through. It can potentially look like somebody just had these ideas, wrote them down on paper, and then just put them out, right? Very polished. And I think it's very useful to see the process that goes into eventually producing the final work and all the messiness that happens along the way.